The question is, historically, we've been so suspicious of the West that today, I think there is an openness, there is a possibility to work proactively with the US on global issues, on climate change, on reforming the global trading system, on reforming the international order, on dealing with the pandemic, post-pandemic global order. For example, India emerging as a critical node in the production of vaccines. So these are all new opportunities. And I think the question is how quickly and how skillfully India can exploit and take advantage of the new situation.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi sir is going to be at the G7 summit, remotely of course. He will be signing in on a video conference at Cornwall in England. That's what your column, Raja Mandala, is about this week. And it's an interesting thing, you sort of look west opportunity for India, because after the years of Trump on the one hand, certain other developments vis-a-vis Russia and China and the US, that there was a sense that, and you say since the 2008 financial crisis, that the West is over. And the rise of China and the rise particularly of belligerent China in terms of foreign policies lent credence to that. So one of the things you say, which is interesting, which I'd like you to expand on a little, is that you said that right after Biden does the G7 summit, he will be meeting Putin as well after a long time. How does that, for India, you mentioned, for Delhi, how important is it, and what role, if any, can it play in if there is an easing of US-Russia tensions, if it can even go back to the pre-2016 kind of normal, or pre-Crimea, Ukraine? How does that help India? Because right now it looks like we get pressure from the Russians for being too close to the US, and the US in turn probably doesn't want us to be too close to Russia.
Exactly. I mean, I think once the Cold War between US and the Soviet Union ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, it really liberated India's foreign policy in the sense that India could now engage with Russia, the post-Soviet Russia, as well as the United States, Europe, Japan, everyone else. Because during the Cold War, India was tied with the Soviet Union, and that constrained India's international options. So the liberation after 91 meant that India could now pursue relations with all the major powers who were not at conflict with each other, which meant that you didn't have to look over your shoulder. If you're doing X with one, you didn't have to worry about what the Y might think. But what's happened in the, as you said, since 2014, has been the deepening division between US and Russia. And for Russia, it was about the US breaking the promises of the compact that they had at the end of the Cold War. They would not extend NATO. They would not push their security closer to the Russian borders. And Russia felt that they wanted to accommodate into the West and they were not treated well. So there was a growing resentment within Russia that the West, they reached out to West and the West has humiliated them. While in US and in Europe, the sense that, look, Russia was being unreasonable, Russia was not being democratic enough, and that it is constantly picking fights, meant that the contradictions between US and Russia grew. On the face of it, Russia is only barely $1.6 trillion compared to nearly, $21 trillion of the US and has equal amount in the European Union. But yet Russia has enough clout to create problems. And that's what we've seen. And the more they got into more antagonistic, the US-Russia relations became. For India now, there were new constraints that it could not now, for example, India wants to buy the S-400 missiles. Yeah. The Americans say, no, if you do that, we might impose sanctions. That we engage with Russia on a range of issues, and that creates difficulties with the West. And Russians feel that, look, why is India getting so close to the Americans? So for India, I think, if the US and Russians have a reasonable relationship, I don't think it is anybody's claim at this point, one summit is going to make them friends again. But even a relaxation of tensions between them will open up space for India. And part of the problem for India has been, while Russia was fighting with the US, it's also become very close to China at a time when India-China relations have deteriorated. So it's a double whammy for India, that deteriorating US-Russia relationship and improving Russia-China relationship have made life difficult for us. And we hope that if things improve between Washington and Moscow, it'll ease life a bit for Indian diplomacy and strategy.
So the second thing, now that you bring up China, China has, of course, been looming large. And how do you see Biden, Johnson, of course, but Biden in the European Union, even what do you think the long term, the medium term, and the long term best case scenario for Biden is vis-a-vis China and building an alliance around it? Obviously, in they're looking. I mean, America is looking at the Indo-Pacific as is much of the Western powers now as a big thing, and how and to what. How can that strategic advantage that India has? Is there any way in which that can lead to a sort of economic advantage for India as well? Because that is ultimately one of the big aims of engaging with the West.
I think it depends on India's skill at carving out an advantage. I think what is happening today, for nearly 40 years, from the late 70s to 2008, US was in China were on the same side. There was a dramatic integration between the two economies, massive people-to-people contact, and Wall Street loved China, Silicon Valley loves China. American universities, Chinese Mandarin became the second most important foreign language being learned. So the huge interaction between the two, at that time people were calling it chimerica, meant that China became very powerful with access to American market by expanding its economy, and a good relationship with China, with the US meant China could construct a new set of partnerships with US allies in Asia, that is Japan, ASEAN. A whole region became part of Chinese economy. And I think everybody was happy with this. But you saw Trump challenge this framework and saying, look, our problem is with, that is your problem is with China. At that time, a lot of people criticized him for being too aggressive towards China. But what we've seen since Biden has come to power at the beginning of this year, that they now agree with Trump's perception that, look, China is a long-term challenge, not just to the US economy, to US values, and more broadly to the Western alliance system. So I think very few people expected this turn of events, but it is now, Biden is making it very clear that they have a real problem with China and they're going to confront it head on. I think we are then in a new situation. And unlike Trump, who's somewhat of a, shall we say, I'm trying to find a decent word, maverick, of doing things in a impulsive manner, Biden is going about it in a more purposeful, systematic manner of bringing the allies together, of creating a framework to deal with the Chinese challenge. Now, this, I think, opens an important strategic opportunity for India. Just as China took advantage of the US relationship when US and Russia were fighting the Cold War and became a strong country, that India can similarly draw closer to the US and the West, gain access to their markets, do more economic cooperation, and strengthen its capabilities. Now, a lot of the people in India believe, oh, that means, are we abandoning non-alignment? China did not abandon non-alignment. China did not abandon independent foreign policy. It seized an interesting opportunity at the global level to build itself up. So the question is, can India do the same? After all, the international conditions are not the same in terms of globalization. There are problems with globalization today in the US, in the West, unlike in the late 70s and the 80s. But there are opportunities, I think, that we can work more closely with the West without having to abandon your basic principles, because America is not asking India to join an alliance, nor is India looking for an alliance with the United States. The question is, historically, we've been so suspicious of the West that today, I think there is an openness, there is a possibility to work proactively with the US on global issues, on climate change, on reforming the global trading system, on reforming the international order, on dealing with the pandemic, post-pandemic global order. For example, India emerging as a critical node in the production of vaccines. So these are all new opportunities. And I think the question is how quickly and how skillfully India can exploit and take advantage of the new situation.
So finally, you end the piece, and this is it's not a question, but you end the piece with saying that India has, we haven't looked West in the way that we have been historically champions of the global South, taking on an important voice in articulating the developing world's concerns. Do you see that as, keeping that advantage that we had historically, do you think that has diminished somewhat India's credibility, say in Africa? For a long time, India had a huge amount of credibility, both from the history of the independence struggle and then moving onward thanks to non-alignment and various other things. do you think that in this kind of situation where, say, you're a major player in negotiating climate change, any kind of global climate change agreements that happen, India does have, and it's recognized that if India and China say don't adhere to their commitments, everything falls apart. Do you see that historical, if you want to call it an advantage or a legacy, that legacy playing into how we move forward in these multilateral organizations?
But I think if you go back to independence, I think the two great moves of independent India, one was to build Asian unity, solidarity. That is, look east, it came back in the 90s in a different form. Other was the non-aligned movement, the Global South, the G77. So these were the two initiatives, but both ended up, this is not what we tell ourselves. So both did not produce the results. You might have generated a lot of goodwill, that we were meeting them more in New York, our Global South allies, rather than doing trade, commerce. And in fact, India's inward-oriented policies actually shrunk the historic trade and economic links with Africa, with the Middle East, with Southeast Asia. So while we became a political talk show, took up some good issues on apartheid, etc. But we allowed the economic relationship to drift. But China, once it got reformed, today China is an investor in the Global South. So the Global South is also looking to India. Can you invest? Can you be an option on building infrastructure? Can you give me vaccines? Can you help me with my military? So they're not looking for, this trade union, a global trade union, to stand up and shout in New York. They want India's skills, capacity, capital, technology. So I think our opportunities in the Global South have significantly increased. We have diversified our relationships across, whether it is through ASEAN, whether it is with African Union. The problem for India has been, it's not been able to service the demand for cooperation. Not that it is losing ground, it is actually unable to service the demand because vaccines is a clear case. We thought we were there, we're getting there, and suddenly, because of the surge and the shortfall of vaccines, we saw how we fell. But today, that on infrastructure, a lot of people want India to do take projects. We were doing it in the 60s on G2G basis, but today, China does huge amount of projects. We can do the same. So I think that's where that it has to be a reimagination. So just because we draw closer to the West does not mean you abandon your goodwill and clout in the Global South, or you abandon Asia. It's a new framework in which we got to connect with Global South. So retain your autonomy, building on your traditional assets in the Global South, continuing your contact with the East. We can add a new dimension to it, which is working with the West, that is US and North America and Europe, on global issues, on climate change, where we can actually contribute to stability, prosperity, and growth in the non-Western world.
Great. Thanks a lot. That's everyone. You should actually, the piece is much more structured than my questions sometimes. So you should have a look at it definitely. The link will be wherever you're seeing this video or in the IndianExpress.com. It will be up on the homepage as well as in the opinion section. Thanks so much, sir.